Sport, an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. Sports have been around for over 3,000 years. When it was first introduced in America as a form of entertainment, it was targeted at cisgendered white males. Cisgendered meaning a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex. Because of this, people of color, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ community are at a disadvantage no matter what sport they are participating in. To give an idea, college esports suffer from a lack of girls and women participating in the space, with stakeholders arguing that programs need to provide a wider range of activities for marginalized groups like women, people of color, and LGBTQ+ to interface with. This disadvantage heavily impacts an athlete's life because they not only have to rise against their cisgendered white male counterparts, but also against racism and discrimination. Racism is a major reason why many African Americans become just athletes. It limits the opportunities for African American student athletes and current or retired professional African American athletes. It requires them to not only be good at their respective sport, but also be an activist for change. This plays a major role in the lives of African American athletes. For years, African Americans athletes have dealt with racial injustice and used their platforms to stand up against it. In 1968, for example, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, gold and bronze medalists in the 200-meter run at the Olympic Games, staged the famous Black Power protest, raising clenched fists with black gloves as the national anthem was played on the medal stand. Both were kicked off of the U.S. Olympic team and were ostracized by much of white America. This ostracization of the two athletes greatly empowered others and inspired them to stand up as well. Even 46 years after both athletes spoke out against injustice, athletes of color still suffer greatly in more ways now than ever. Not only do the professional African American athletes have to deal with racism, but the student athletes have to as well. Student athletes deal with racism both on the field and in the school system. They have to deal with the lack of effort given to improve their educational success compared to their white counterparts. Student athletes of color are said to face specific difficulties such as social and academic integration and racism. One of the biggest things that athletes have to deal with in school is microaggressions. A microaggression is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. In a study by Daniel Slorenzo in 2014, the athletes gave these sayings as examples of microaggressions they hear every day. When I, a white person, talk about those blacks, I wasn't really talking about you. You, a black person, are not like the rest of them. You're different. If only there were more of them, black people like you, a black person. And I don't think of you, a black person, as black. Another big portion of racism in schools are the disciplinary actions taken. Initial analysis indicate that black preschool students are 3.6 times more likely than their white peers to be given one or more out-of-school suspensions. In K through 12, the trend continues, with 18% of black boys receiving suspensions and 10% of black girls, while only 6% of all K through 12 students receive more out-of-school suspensions. Further, black students are 1.9 times as likely to be expelled from school and are 2.3 times more likely to be disciplined through law enforcement. This not only affects the student's school record, but can also prevent them from playing their sport and going to their dream college. The injustice doesn't stop with schools or power protests. Famous tennis player Serena Williams speaks up on the topic of racism in sports and her role as a public figure of color. I play for me, she told Claudia Reinecke in a 2015 interview, but I also play and represent something much greater than me. I embrace that, I love that, I want that. So ultimately, when I'm out there on the court, I am playing for me. During her years as a tennis player, she has learned and realized that what she is doing is not just winning her matches, she is destroying the stereotype and prejudice of African American athletes. Her father realized that with both of his daughters playing tennis professionally, that they would have to deal with the worst. So he hired local kids to stand around their nearby tennis court and yell the worst things they could imagine at them, from slurs to threats. In 2003, Serena and her sister Venus got invited to the NAACP Image Awards. At the awards, they were both awarded the President's Award. During her speech, Venus said this: "We were hitting balls, and all we wanted to do was play good tennis, play for ourselves, and all of a sudden, it became more than that. We don't play just for ourselves anymore. We play for all of us in the black community." Venus's statement reveals that she's cognizant of the particular encouragement and loyalty directed towards her and Serena by their black fans. Similarly, she and Serena recognize that their accomplishments have a meaning that extends beyond them to black communities. Society stacks African American athletes in skilled positions as opposed to thinking ones. The absence of African Americans in decision-making leadership positions at universities, professional leagues, labor exploitation, and even in the salaries and endorsement opportunities of professional athletes are prime examples of this. To give specifics, Sports Illustrated has been publishing sports-related magazines for about 67 years. In these 67 years, only 35 African-American athletes have been featured on the cover of said magazines. This lack of representation can cause fewer African-American children to become athletes and aspire to be more than just an athlete. In many ways, the racial challenges confronting athletes parallel those elsewhere in American society. Team executives need to overcome their bias and consider black candidates as viable for the decision-making jobs in sports and other occupations. Tampa Bay Rays pitcher Chris Archer, who is among the shrinking number of African Americans in Major League Baseball, said this in his interview with Michael A. Fletcher. "We are told we can only entertain," he said, "but every team has doctors, lawyers, and economists." However, an athlete's activism can also affect the audience and their sports league. Amid the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, many athletes protested and did not participate in their respective sport. For example, starting with the Milwaukee Bucks, 6 NBA teams stopped dribbling because too many fellow citizens would rather they shut up and watch a man get shot in the back without a sense of desperation. This historic protest delayed the NBA playoffs for weeks. The delay caused heavy backlash from some Americans and some sponsors to withdraw from the event. This is not the first time the NBA has experienced the loss of sponsors due to reasons related to race. Around 1984, sponsors were flocking out of the NBA because it was perceived as a bunch of high-salaried, drug-sniffing black guys. The fact that after 3 decades, the same things are happening in the NBA validates that racism in sports is still a key issue. One of the main contributors to this racism is that some people believe that African American athletes are built to succeed. They believe that they have different muscles that are built for certain sports. An example of someone saying this is golfer Jack Nicklaus. He stated that the reason there are not more African American golfers playing at the highest levels in the sport is that blacks have different muscles that react in different ways. This way of thinking causes people to inadvertently undermine African American athletes' success by attributing their success to different muscles rather than their hard work. Since racism has been around for over 4 centuries, there have been many solutions created and executed. However, most did not work. Nonetheless, there are 2 most prominent solutions for racism in sports. They are to create a zero-tolerance racism policy and to always support athletes who speak up. Each solution has its benefits and limitations. Creating a zero-tolerance racism policy would discourage coaches, judges, and audience members from making comments that could be considered racist. However, bribery would decrease the punishment of the perpetrator. Supporting athletes who speak up would increase the publication of the issue and decrease the amount of racism that that athlete would face. However, the athlete could take advantage of this and lie for publicity, and that athlete could face major backlash and could be fired from their sports league. The best solution would be to combine the 2. Combining the 2 would remove some of the risk if just one was enforced, because in the new policy there would be a fine for athletes if they lie, and there would be more regulation on bribery and racism in general. While this new policy won't be able to stop racism completely and would cost a bit more than usual, it will help decrease the amount of racism that people face in their everyday lives. And then, why we're excited.
Number 1, what evidence did you gather that you ultimately didn't use in your presentation, and why didn't you use it? Why did you make that choice?
One specific source that I didn't really use was an article called "Race and Class: The African American Athletes' Experience on a White Campus" by Bertie Murty. I don't know how to pronounce her name, but I didn't really use it for a multitude of reasons. One was because I couldn't find enough evidence to like directly say that she was a reliable author. Because compared to all of my other sources, I double-checked that they were either cited in other papers multiple times or that they had a very specific type of paper that they wrote on very specific topics. But for her, I couldn't find that. And also, in her paper, she cited another source, and I ended up using that one instead of hers.
And then additionally, if you had more time, what additional research would you conduct related to this issue?
If I had more time, I would try to incorporate more of the reasons why the other solutions to racism in sports haven't worked and what they were specifically. I found a few, but I could never find like why they didn't work, so I didn't feel like it would benefit to include it. I feel like it would just be more information and not reasons. So if I had more time, I would definitely research those more.